And Achane could be that third guy, especially. I love the fact that they didn't have a lot of draft capital. They didn't really need to go get a running back in the third round, but they did. And that speaks to, I think, getting a fast guy on the field, a 4.3, 240 at the NFL Combine, so there's a lot to love about what he can potentially become. And that's why you're gravitating toward him. Again, for me, it would be the first Dolphins running back to take. But I don't shy away from the other two guys, but I don't mind pairing two Dolphins running backs, give it a few weeks, and then see what happens.
Well, preseason football has finally started. All the training camp hype videos are going up on Twitter and social media. And we're going to be talking about players that are rising up our rankings. We're joined with special guest Jamey Eisenberg of Fantasy Football Today from CBS Sports. And Jamey, the guy that you're going to talk about here is probably the buzziest, if that's the word we want to use, buzziest rookie right now that people are talking about. And it's a wide receiver.
Yes. First off, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it. Zay Flowers is very interesting at the receiver spot there for the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, there's a lot of expectations about what this offense is going to look like and what the abilities are of the three guys I think that Lamar Jackson is going to have to lean on. But he's the healthiest of the three, in my opinion. Rashaad Bateman coming back from the foot injury and Odell Beckham coming off of, his 85th knee injury. But I think, Flowers has a chance to, be the guy there for Lamar Jackson. And he's gotten a head start on, the rapport ahead of Bateman at least and for this year. And, I'm just excited about the situation at Todd Monken's offense.
Yeah, I think we're going to get along really well on this show, Jamey, because we have been talking about Zay Flowers all off season long. I actually just tweeted out this morning my exposure to rookies. You figure a 1 in 12 shot gives you about 8.3% exposure is average for a player. I'm at 17% Zay Flowers. Like, I can't get enough of this guy when I'm looking at him in the 7th or 8th round. I just see such a high ceiling for him in this new Todd Monken offense. So completely in agreement with you on that one.
Yeah, Flowers seems like a really fun player, and we've seen that rookie wide receivers, they can produce early. Like, it's not as taboo as it used to be. The one thing that I do start to ask then, though, is like, how worried do you get? J.K. Dobbins comes back, Rashaad Bateman may be healthy. We still don't know. Odell Beckham, I think we're all kind of counting him out, but like, what if he actually does produce? And then we're talking about Zay Flowers Dave, we have an obligatory thing here. We have to talk about pie, but Zay Flowers gets a smaller piece of the pie than maybe we're expecting. How much does that worry you going into the season?
Well, I think you said it. You're talking about round 7. So typically, I think when we get to that point in the draft, you're looking for upside. It's easy to draft players that have a good floor. And I think, depending on your roster build, that certainly matters. But for me, I'm looking at that point when we get to the middle part of the draft, who could be a difference maker, who could help me win my fantasy championship? Because not that you're necessarily going the first or last strategy, because I don't know if you have to go that route when you're talking about these mid-range picks. But if he is the best receiver in Baltimore and there is a better passing attack from what we've seen over the past couple of years, and Odell Beckham proves to be a guy in his early 30s, and Rashaad Bateman once again struggles to get healthy, I think, first off, we're going to see a more explosive Baltimore offense across the board because of the system change and just allowing Lamar Jackson to play a little bit more free as a passer, which I think will still allow him to run. Will allow J.K. Dobbins, I think, to have maybe a career season, especially if he's healthy and gets more involved in the passing game. But look, I don't expect Zay Flowers to all of a sudden become a top 10 wide receiver. I don't expect him to become rookie Justin Jefferson. But I think he could have a season where in a 3-receiver league, he's a consistent starter. Some weeks he'll help me win my week against my opponent. But if he can get even better than that, become a top 20 caliber player, we saw Marquise Brown have a lot of good moments with Lamar Jackson as that number 1 receiver, number 2 target behind Mark Andrews. So again, it's about expectations. But when I start to get to that point in the draft, I'm looking for ceiling as opposed to floor. These are the players that we talk about can be replaced with waiver wire guys. You don't want to do that, but that's the case that could happen when we get to this point in the draft. So it's about just, balancing what the expectations are, but also, shooting for the ceiling as opposed to the floor.
And the last thing I'll say about Zay Flowers, and I've talked about this a little bit throughout the offseason, but in the NFL draft, we saw 4 wide receivers go in the first round, and they went back to back to back to back. Jackson Smith-Njigba, Quentin Johnson, Zay Flowers, and Jordan Addison. And Zay Flowers is the cheapest of the bunch. So if we are looking at draft capital as how the NFL feels about talent evaluation, why wouldn't you want to get the cheapest first-round wide receiver? Again, completely in agreement with you, Jamey. Love that we started off the show in full agreement across the board.
All right. Well, if you've been enjoying this conversation so far, be sure to like this video, drop your comments below, maybe some players that you are seeing rise up in the ranks you got questions about, or maybe you think that, Dave's player that he's going to talk about here is just really stupid and awful, and you want to comment on that. Go for it. People love bashing Dave in the comments. It's my favorite pastime to read those. And make sure you're subscribed to the show. We're going to be giving you 2 episodes a week here in the preseason. Once we get into the regular season, we're going to give you Monday through Thursday with a Sunday morning live start sit. So you're not going to want to miss any of that. And also go on over to footballguys.com, check out our custom rankings that we have where you can see the players that are moving up and down Dave's rankings. Probably don't want to look at those, but you can go check out my rankings instead, see which players are moving up. You can see our new upside downside meter, check out the consensus ADP that's going to take into account websites like CBS Sports, and you can check out how the ADP is being changed as mock drafts are happening and real life drafts are happening. All right, Dave, we are now on to another wide receiver here who we've talked about him just like a very little bit. The camp hype videos are out of control, and I don't know, have you turned a new leaf? It seems like you are now the conductor for the camp hype train.
It's tough because I'm trying to find this balance between I don't want to flip flop on my takes, but I also want to take in new information and try to adapt as we hear new information. And if you listen to me in March, April, May, even early June, I was all aboard the Christian Kirk hype train saying I don't expect Calvin Ridley to be able to bounce back, 2 years removed from football, 29 years old, injured, on a new team with a new quarterback. But I find myself kind of warming up to it now. And a big piece of it is I saw him getting drafted in the 3rd and 4th round. And I said, what am I missing here? Why are people drafting him so high? And I went back and I watched some games from 2020 and I said, oh, yeah, Calvin Ridley is really, really good at football. And I kind of forgot about it. I have a short memory, like a lot of fantasy football drafters here. And really, I mean, it's hard to make a case built on data for Calvin Ridley because when you look at his career trajectory, 2 years buried behind Julio Jones, then he had one breakout year in 2020 when Julio Jones got hurt, and then he had the opportunity in 2021 and got injured. Then he was suspended in 2022. So trying to find historical comps is pretty much impossible. You're not going to find anybody that has been on the trajectory that Calvin Ridley has been. But for me, I'm just trying to bet on the talent. We know that he's a good player. He was getting ranked as a top 5 wide receiver back in 2021 when Julio Jones had left the Atlanta Falcons. And now he is on a offense that is trending upward. They were 9th in pass attempts last year, and I don't expect them to slow down that pass rate whatsoever. And I had some concerns, after a couple of years off, like I mentioned, but looking at these camp clips, man, he looks smooth and quick as ever. So I'm not trying to overthink it here. And I am simply betting on the talent and just taking away everything that I said early in the offseason and drafting Calvin Ridley now.
Dave, where are you on Ridley in terms of, because the ADP has been all over the place right now. I know in home leagues, you're probably going to have people being a bit more conservative. They're a bit more worried, especially with how a lot of people felt like they maybe got burned last year with Deshaun Watson and, players being out of the game for so long. But over on Underdog Fantasy, where you have a lot of people who are leaning more towards those wide receiver heavy builds, Calvin Ridley, I believe, is the wide receiver 15 right now. He is getting up there. Where is that level where you're comfortable with drafting Calvin Ridley, where you say, okay, he is worth the risk because he can totally just alter my team?
So I don't think he's going to be going that high in your home league drafts. Looking at Underdog ADP, people are playing for millions of dollars against hundreds of thousands of people in tournaments. So they're swinging for the high end range of outcomes there. And I think that's what it comes down to. If you look at Christian Kirk, his range of outcomes is much more narrow. We know that he's got a safe floor, but even if everything falls into place for Christian Kirk, he's probably never going to be like a 1,500 yard receiver. His ceiling is probably 1,300 yards. Maybe he can get into the double digit touchdown range. But if everything works out for Calvin Ridley, we've seen historically that he can be one of the most dominant receivers on the field. So if everything breaks right for him, he can be an elite, a top 5, a top 3 wide receiver finisher. So I think that's why he's getting steamed up in these underdog drafts where everybody is trying to swing for the fences with every single pick. So I'm okay taking him at the 3-4 turn in underdog. I'm hoping that once we get into redraft season and you're drafting on sleeper in your home leagues, then we're looking at him a little bit more affordable, maybe in the 5th or 6th round. And at that price, I'm completely in. If you can get a guy like Calvin Ridley as your wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3, you can really set yourself up for a good team.
Yeah, wide receiver 3, that'd be great. That's the ultimate boom bust guy that you want there at that spot. And last question on Calvin Ridley, and Jamey, I'm going to ask you this one. I feel like we kind of don't know enough about Trevor Lawrence and his tendencies because we've seen the offense change year after year and his weapons change year after year. And they have a lot of good targets there in Jacksonville. You're talking, yes, Calvin Ridley, but I think we have already started to forget Evan Ingram. Dave was hyping up Christian Kirk a couple weeks ago wearing a Christian Kirk shirt here on the show. And then they're talking about adding, more pass catching, a more pass catching role for the running backs with Tank Bigsby now there. So
And Zay Jones is no schlub either.
Yes, yeah, schlub. You always love using that word. But it's a great word. At the point where I don't know, I do also start to wonder: does this offense need to be a top 5 passing offense for all these guys to get work, or do we think it's going to start to get funneled to some of those better players?
Well, a couple of things. I think one, when you look at some of the best performances for Trevor Lawrence last year, it wasn't just Christian Kirk. It was Zay Jones having a lot of big games. And Calvin Ridley, I think by all accounts, we would all agree that is an upgrade over Zay Jones. So yes, while they do have a lot of mouths to feed there because of Ingram, because of Jones, because of obviously Christian Kirk, but I think it was such a smart move to go get Calvin Ridley when they did, because now you're pairing him with this quarterback on the rise. And we did see the steps that were taken and the improvements that we saw from Trevor Lawrence. And while it wasn't necessarily a huge stretch of statistical great games, just if you watched him, he passed the eyeball test and started to look like the number one prospect. But I think the best thing about Calvin Ridley, and I'll give you a real life scenario because it was drafted Alfredo and I did in the flex leagues, it's a half PPR league where you start as many as 5 wide receivers if you want to. I did get Calvin Ridley as my third receiver. Now I started receiver with Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb. Somehow fell to the second round, middle of the second round. Ended up taking Najee Harris in the third round just because I thought I needed a running back there. But there was Calvin Ridley sitting there in round 4. I would take him in round 3. So I actually considered when I took Najee Harris taking Calvin Ridley. So to get him as a third receiver, again, depending on your build, that's a pretty good spot to be in. But I think you should feel comfortable about him as your number 2 guy. And then just one quick point on Christian Kirk. Remember, he's going to have a solid season, but he was the number 2 guy in Arizona. He played with a pretty good receiver there in DeAndre Hopkins. Probably not as good a pure passing quarterback. I think Trevor Lawrence will prove to be better than Kyler Murray. But I think he's going to still put up good numbers in that secondary role. But I just think Calvin really has that alpha profile. And if he is healthy, after missing all this time, has a chance for an unbelievable standout campaign. So for me, it's once I get past, it's that trio of receivers that basically go at the beginning of the third round, which is Devontae Smith, T. Higgins, Chris Olave, whatever order you want to put them in. After that, it's kind of a free-for-all, I think. If you look at ADP, it's kind of all over the place. Really has just as much upside as anybody. So I think that's a good spot to start to target in the middle to the end of round 3. But I agree. I think if you get him round 4, you'd be pretty thrilled about that type of production.
All right, I'm going to finish us off here with the third and final wide receiver that's rising up the rankings. And I'm going to feel the collective eye roll from everyone watching and listening when I say Skyy Moore, wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs. And right now he's being drafted as the wide receiver 50. So you're able to get him at a wide receiver 5 price point, which I'm starting to move him up. He's getting closer and closer. I mean, he's still a wide receiver 4 for me. Like I haven't, totally start chugging the Kool-Aid on Skyy Moore, but I think there's just certain things that we get to a point here where we can't ignore, right? And you start to look at, the main factors for me is going to be, does he have opportunity, which he does? Is there a continuous drumbeat in camp? There has been. Does he have talent? I think that's yet to be seen from everything I evaluated last year. I really like his talent, and he's in a good offense. So this is now like 4 things that are all really in his favor. And I know that there's been the reports that he is taking every rep with the first team. He's taking every rep in 2 wide receiver sets. We'll see how much that changes when Kadarius Toney comes back. But I think we're at a point here where you can actually start to believe some of the hype on Skyy Moore. He's even said it himself. I'm more comfortable in the offense. The Andy Reid offense is a bit more difficult for wide receivers. And we're seeing that for Rashee Rice, who's not catching up to speed as much as I think that people want him to as a rookie. And Skyy Moore's talked about it. He's like, I don't have to think about where I need to line up. I don't need to think about where my route is going. I'm just thinking about beating the guy in front of me. And the drumbeat has just been very, very consistent. Beat writers have been talking about him, that he should lead all the wide receivers in targets. I think the question then becomes, and I'll ask you this, Jamey, the question then becomes, even if he is the leader for the wide receivers in targets, how valuable is that role? Is it kind of a 1-for-1 replacement of what Juju was last year?
I mean, if that's the place we're starting, that's a pretty good place to be. I know Juju had some disappointing, the season overall was disappointing for Juju because the expectation was he goes to be the quote unquote number 1 receiver for Patrick Mahomes. And I say receiver, obviously Travis Kelce being there, but stepping into the Tyreek Hill role. And that just wasn't going to happen. He wasn't going to play like Tyreek Hill. Now, Skyy Moore has the chance to, if you say he's going to play like Juju, who when the targets were, I think it was like 9 games with at least 5 targets, he was averaging something like, 15 PPR points per game. I mean, I'll sign up for that all day if you're telling me he's the 50th wide receiver off the board. I think, like you said, why the eye rolls will come is most people are going to start to shoot him up draft boards, and understandably so. I love the fact, like you said, he's playing on every down, because I think the thought was, okay, maybe is he going to move into the slot, and then when they're in, more 12 personnel or 2 receivers on the field, then he's coming off the field. Well, if that's not the case, and maybe it's just a placeholder until Kadarius Toney gets back, and then he just kicks back inside when Toney is there. But like you said, he checks all the boxes, aside from having been a consistent producer as a rookie and having the resume. This is when he builds the resume. And, one thing that stood out for me, and obviously it was, the Toney injury kind of said, okay, now who's the next best guy? And I think, everybody sort of points to Skyy Moore as being the one that stepped up. But watching the quarterback documentary, there were a couple of times where Patrick Mahomes was like, man, I missed this throw or I didn't have it. And the guy he was throwing to was Skyy Moore. And I think a lot of that was he wasn't in the right spot. And, you could say, okay, quarterback's fault, receiver fault, whatever. I'm probably going to lean more toward the inexperienced rookie making the mistake as opposed to, maybe the greatest quarterback of all time once things are all said and done. Right. So I think those mistakes will get corrected. The playing time is going to be there. Like you said, the drumbeat is hard to ignore. And so while there hasn't been, a consistent receiver aside from Tyreek Hill, again, just specifically wide receiver in this offense, he's got the opportunity there to be special. So the only thing I think that can wreck it is Kadarius Toney coming back and maybe fulfilling the potential of being a first-round pick and some of the things we saw with the Giants. But at this point, like you said, picking up this offense has been difficult. Toney got hurt week 1, practice 1 of training camp. It's such a huge hedge for Skyy Moore. So, yeah, the sky's the limit, no pun intended, for what he can do this season.
No, the pun was totally intended.
Of course.
We've gotten so spoiled over the last few years, too, with like Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase and Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. And these guys showing up and just like week 1, they're balling on an NFL field. And I think that we are just getting really impatient. We have to remember that Skyy Moore came from Western Michigan University to immediately get plugged into one of the most complex offenses in the NFL. So it's okay to give him a little bit of leniency and know that there is a learning curve that's going to be a little bit steeper than guys that are coming from Power 5 schools. So I'm totally okay just throwing away Skyy Moore's rookie season and looking at him with a completely fresh start now in year 2.
All right, well, we're going to move on here to the running backs in just a moment. But before we do, I want to let you guys know that we have a giveaway that we've only got a little bit of time left. I don't think we've actually put a date on this, Dave, just yet. But just there's just act fast. That's what we're going to do. We're going to do the old salesmanship thing here. Act fast, act now. Okay, you've got just a very limited time left. Enter for a chance to be in the first ever Football Guys Fantasy Football Show Listener League with myself and Dave. All you have to do, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, take a screenshot, send that over to Kluge at footballguys.com, spelled just like my co-host here, Kluge. And once again, I'm not saying you have to leave a 5-star review, but if you leave a 1-star review, you're probably not getting in the league. I'm just going to say that. All right. Okay, Dave, we are moving on over to the 3 running backs on the rise. And Jamey, we're going to go to you first here because you have a guy who Dave actually really likes, and I know he was very excited when he saw the show sheet here. I'm going to eye roll a little bit, but I want to hear what you have to say about Rashaad Penny for the Philadelphia Eagles.
I mean, talk about a 24-hour, potential change. I think when I sent it to you, then we got all these reports about Kenneth Gainwell being the number 1 guy there, which would be a little surprising. But the show, obviously, the topic is rankings risers, and it's hard to ignore, I think the other side of this Eagles backfield, which is DeAndre Swift being used mostly in a pass catching role. And so when you look at the way these guys profile, especially if you're telling me that it's Trey Sermon and Boston Scott competing for the final roster spot there, that I think the history will tell us the most talented guy, I think, is Rashaad Penny. And, clearly there's injuries and you have to factor that in and the investment that they made in him and basically giving him, as minimal a contract as you can give anybody in the NFL, especially at that position. But there's an opportunity, I think, for him to prove himself and, going to a situation where there's so many vacated touches without Miles Sanders there's the opportunity to play behind maybe the best offensive line he's ever had. And it's still, I know we kind of look at Miles Sanders and say, okay, he was, not a big pass catcher and, didn't get the rushing touchdowns because of Jalen Hurts and how they used him. We'll find out again, just what happens with him in Carolina if he, I'll avoid that sidetrack. But I think just, again, we're talking about opportunity and vacated touches and talent here. And so it's hard to ignore what Rashaad Penny can be. I don't like the fact that, I forget the beat writer, so I apologize, but, suggesting that he's only been with the second and third team offenses so far in the majority of practice. That's not encouraging. But that also could be, a veteran, favor to Kenneth Gainwell, who's the one that's been with the team and giving him that chance to, sort of maybe prove himself first. But, he wasn't explosive in the opportunities that he had. Again, that could change. It's very similar to Dave, what you said about Skyy Moore. Maybe give the younger player a pass, learning a complex system and having to prove himself. And maybe this is his chance to do so. But just in terms of, again, I'll go back to what I said about Zay Flowers. Who can give me upside in this range? If he hits, we've seen that, the end of the 2021 season when he was with Seattle, some of the other moments that he had with the Seahawks. So better offensive line, better situation, big opportunity. I don't want to say I want to trust him as a starter, but I do want to take a chance to put him on my bench. And if he hits, then I have a guy that maybe for a pocket of season, I like to use that phrase a lot. What pocket of season can I maybe rely on somebody? And if Rashaad Penny's healthy and the guy for Philadelphia, he'll probably be in a lot of starting lineups, whether running back 1, running back 2, or flex. That could be a guy that can help you win some weeks.
Dave, I want to ask you this because I already know that you're high on Rashaad Penny. I see that Jamey's got him going up the ranks. When you see the reports like this, where they release a ridiculous unofficial depth chart that has 4 guys listed at the running back spot, and then poor Kennedy Brooks sitting as the fifth string running back by himself, and then you hear these reports, how much weight do you give them when you start to hear them? Because then you got Eagles fans coming out of the woodwork saying like, "Oh, this beat reporter always just fabricates things." How much weight do you give that when you start to see these reports that maybe Rashaad Penny might not be the RB1 for the Eagles?
I am putting as much weight into that Philadelphia Eagles depth chart as I am into the Atlanta Falcons depth chart that had Bijan Robinson listed as RB3. Yeah, I'm not too concerned about depth charts at this point in the season. For me, I'm looking at the talent. And I think like if the fantasy football gods came down from the heavens and said no injuries are going to happen this year, everybody is playing 17 games, we're drafting Rashaad Penny in the 2nd or 3rd round. I mean, the talent and the opportunity on this offense is just, it's an unbelievable pairing. We talked about that last weekend with Dwayne McFarland, that opportunity is the biggest thing for running backs. And then if you get a talented running back that falls into opportunity, that's when magic happens. And that's exactly what we're looking at with Rashaad Penny. The only reason he's getting drafted where he is because of injury concerns. So Jamey, you said it earlier when talking about Zay Flowers. At that point in the draft, when you're in round 7, 8, 9, 10, you're swinging for upside. And I don't know if there's a player or a running back with more upside in those rounds than Rashaad Penny.
I want to go just real quick. My colleague Chris Towers at CBS found this. It was a tweet from Elliot Shore-Parks, who might be the beat writer that we're referencing in terms of what the report was about Kenneth Gainwell being the starter. This was a year ago, August 3rd. And his tweet was, Eagles are definitely rotating running backs more in practice than last year. Miles Sanders, 10 first-team reps. Boston Scott, 5 first-team reps. Kenneth Gainwell, no first-team reps, but 6 second-team reps and 1 third-team rep. So this might be the pattern of them just working through some things. And Chris alluded to this. I don't remember exactly what it was. That I do remember Miles Sanders battling a little bit of a hamstring problem. So maybe that had to do with a little bit more of the rotation. But this could just be what Nick Sirianni likes to do, is just to sort of see who works, what works, let the new guys sort of prove themselves. And that could be what's happening again here. So obviously nothing to say that this is, year over year, same thing, that they're just going to rotate guys and then figure out who the best one is. And they already knew it going in. But just something to put some context to it, that a year ago at this time, they were mixing and matching guys as well.
Yeah, and I think that should also just be a common understanding too, especially at the running back position, where these guys, you want to control their workload. You want to see you want to give those 2nd and 3rd team guys reps with the first team, because it may actually happen in games. So that's kind of our yearly reminder not to overreact to these things. Remember, this time last year, we were all out on Josh Jacobs because he put snaps in the Hall of Fame game, right?
Yep.
That's the obligatory reminder. Okay, well, Dave, we've been talking about these running backs that have injuries and may need load management, and that just kind of transitions perfectly into the player that you're here to talk about. That's Javonte Williams, running back for the Denver Broncos.
Yeah, I mean, how wrong were we in the spring when we were looking at Javonte Williams and Breece Hall both suffering ACL tears, and we thought that Breece Hall was going to be back to 100% by week 1, and Javonte Williams was the one that was going to struggle to come back. Now here we are, less than a month from kickoff, and Javonte Williams was cleared. They said Sean Payton just said on Thursday that he is at 100% capacity. I don't know if it's true or not. It could be coach speak, but when you watch him in camp, he's cutting, he's running, he's getting reps with the first team, and Javonte Williams is a very, very talented player. He is one of 4 running backs since 2006 to have 60 plus missed tackles in his rookie season. Last year, before he got hurt, he was averaging 7 targets per game with Russell Wilson. And then he's got the profile that you want to target. You know, he was an early second round pick. He was drafted in 2021 behind only Najee Harris and Travis Etienne. There are obviously some concerns here with the ACL, but right now we're here that he's practicing with no limitations. So we talked about this a lot early in the offseason with Breece Hall. You know, age and athleticism are the two indicators for a quick recovery from an ACL tear. And Javonte Williams is 23 years old with off the charts athleticism. So maybe we were betting on the wrong guy early in the offseason by drafting Breece Hall in round 3 and 4, when it looks like Javonte Williams is the guy that has recovered a little bit quicker. So we've talked a ton about the Broncos offense this year. And I think everybody is in agreement that the offense can't be worse than it was last year. So if we're looking at Javonte Williams, who saw a very good snap share and a target share last year in this offense, and we're expecting an uptick in efficiency, and Javonte Williams is healthy, it seems like there is a huge misprice right now in his ADP. And I don't think that he's going to creep up too much because of the gruesome reports about that injury, but he's a guy that I am more than happy to take a chance on right now at his current cost.
Yeah, right now he's a bit lower on Underdog Fantasy, but if you head on over to footballguys.com and see the consensus ADP from various sites, I think those will catch up. But as of right now, he's still at running back 25. I'm curious to see how that's going to shape out. So, Jamey, I'm going to ask you this question. We've been talking about all these guys having upside because there is inherent risk. You're drafting them later. They have injury concerns, whatever it is. The upside for Javonte Williams, how much of it do you see? Do you think that even if he is, quote, healthy, there could be a pretty good split here between Samaje Perine, or is this really Javonte's backfield to own?
I'm still skeptical. I hope it's his backfield to own. That just really hasn't been Sean Payton's MO. You know, he's liked to use, multiple backs, and, this was a guy in Perine that they targeted. I think it's very encouraging that this is really the only guy that they brought in. There was the rumor about if Josh Jacobs was let go. Now, maybe just because he's coming off leading the NFL in rushing, that you take a chance on that guy to make your team better, because that would obviously be the case anywhere he goes for the most part. But I'm just skeptical of the injury. Like you mentioned, he does fit the profile of guys that bounce back. Well, so did Saquon Barkley, and his first year off the ACL was not great. You saw J.K. Dobbins, and again, you could debate who's better and whatnot, but same profile in terms of year of service, age, and hopefully similar type of athletic profile. And he missed or only played in 8 games last year because there was a second procedure that was required. And Dalvin Cook, his rookie season suffered the ACL tear, and his production in year 2 was not the same. So I think it's fantastic that he's back. I think, again, we're talking taking upside at the spot that he's going, RB25, which is typically around round 6, round 7 anyway. It's the perfect time to take a chance on him. But my fear is that the more positive reports you hear, the more things that we talk about him being ready to go ahead of Breece Hall, all those things. It does speak to Breece Hall should definitely drop in drafts. But I think if Javonte rises too much, then I'm 100% out, because I'm just skeptical that while, again, there will be those pockets where he'll be very good. And I love the offensive line upgrades. I love certainly the coaching upgrades. Hard to overlook those things. Javonte, unfortunately, he shared in college. He shared in the, early portion of his NFL career. I think he'll share touches again. So injury concerns, just in terms of, maybe another, reoccurrence, or what we see a lot, happen for Dalvin Cook, specifically his first year back. There are a lot of hamstring problems. We see that pop up from time to time because they're overcompensating in their rehab and recovery. I'm just a little skeptical on Javonte bouncing back to that level. So can he be a top 20 running back? Yes. Can he be a top 10 guy? I'm probably out on that type of expectation.
Yeah, I agree there. And if his ADP does creep up, I mean, I'm not spending a 4th or a 5th round pick on Javonte Williams. Where he's going right now, I'm happy to take him, though. And I think there was, you mentioned J.K. Dobbins, and I think there was such like a visceral reaction among football fans and fantasy football players when Javonte Williams got injured. And they said this is the same injury J.K. Dobbins had: ACL, MCL, LCL, meniscus, all that. And so many people got burned by J.K. Dobbins last year that he was on my do not draft list as soon as they made that comparison to Dobbins. But if you look this time last year, a month away from camp, J.K. Dobbins wasn't practicing. He was limping around the field. He had a huge bulky brace on his knee, and Javonte Williams doesn't have any of that. So I think that there is obviously risk that he re-injures himself, or that he's not the same player he was and you burned your 7th or 8th round pick. But if he does come back and is healthy, I mean, it would be an outlier from ACL tear history. But if he is able to do that, I mean, that just has league winner stamped all over it.
Yeah, and look, it's happened to Adrian Peterson. It happened to Jamal Charles the first time it happened. So it's not, completely out of the realm of possibility. It's not just, okay, you get the ACL tear, it's got to be year 2, and then all of a sudden, all systems go. So it can easily happen, but, more times than not, they tend to struggle. So it's just again, moderating expectations. And if he's going in this range, he is well worth it because of what he can give you if he is one of those guys.
I think we can all agree that all the players, especially running backs that are going in this range, for the most part, they're all going to be a calculated risk, right? So I think it just goes right back to that same conversation we've been having is what is the upside with these guys? And I'm going to finish this off here with a player that I think has a ton of upside, even as a rookie, and it's Achane, running back for the Miami Dolphins, who right now he's being drafted as the RB 41. And I always have kind of like a weird thing with Dolphins players. Like for years, it was just like, I can't really draft him because I was a fan of the team. I still am, but like, you never really had that many good fantasy assets from it. So now that all of a sudden they're a good offense, I have to start looking at them objectively and be like, okay, you can actually draft and start a lot of these players. And I think the thing that's been suppressing Achane's average draft position right now has been the fear that Dalvin Cook might sign there. And I think that seems like it's becoming less and less apparent as the days go on. Like New York or New England still might be a good fit for him. For me, I kind of just look at this backfield and I start to think of the attrition that could happen as the season goes on. Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson have missed 6 or more games in nearly every season of their career. Last year was kind of an outlier for them. And I think that once you have a good player like Achane, a guy who's able to make these explosive plays, it's going to be very hard to keep him off the field. And I'm talking about running backs that might get injured. Let's not even mention the wide receivers. If Jalen Waddle misses any time, Achane and his speed becomes a much bigger part of the offense. Same thing can be said for Tyreek Hill. So I think that you're going to be looking at a guy who he may not be, the big time feature back in your first 3-4 weeks, but these rookie running backs and rookies really in general, we've seen that as we get to the midway point of the season, you almost regret dropping them for that, that filler roster clogger that you got for 2 weeks, the Latavius Murray, and then you drop Achane, and all of a sudden you're like, man, I really wish I had him now that it's week 8. I think that last year, what we were able to see, and this was actually cool because I was very intrigued by this, 17 games where a Miami Dolphins running back was a top 24 fantasy running back. So combined, Jeff Wilson or Raheem Mostert were basically always a startable running back. The problem was trying to figure out which one. And so I do understand that problem could still be around here for Achane, but if he does take control of this backfield, and we've seen that ambiguous backfields land to good draft day value, I think Achane could really pay dividends. And Jamey, I want to ask you this. When you see these ambiguous backfields where, you've got 2 or 3 guys, how do you try to navigate that? Do you try to make the case for which one can be most explosive, or is it just sort of, let me just take the cheapest guy and hope it works out?
It's usually the latter, and especially in the case of Mike McDaniel coming from the San Francisco system, which prior to Christian McCaffrey was almost always the case. For the majority of Kyle Shanahan's tenure in San Francisco, he had a different leading rusher year after year, and that speaks to those guys getting hurt, but also those guys just cycling through and just finding the next guy that could step up and perform. For me, when it comes to the Dolphins backfield, and I'll talk about this with Roschon Johnson as well, they're so cheap, these 2 backfields. You can take 2 of these guys and just sort of see what shakes out. And for me, with the Dolphins, it would be Achane and one of the other 2, whoever is left. Because I think you do have to make the investment in Achane first because of the intrigue and the possibility of him, sort of being a potential difference maker. The thing I can't get past, though, he's so small. He really is just, not the type of guy that profiles as a feature guy. But in this offense, you don't necessarily have to be that way. I wish there was more of a track record of them throwing to their running backs, whether it's the coach in the system and the quarterback. And I think that's where he has to win, because I don't see him being the goal line guy. And I think we're going to see a lot of big plays, and we know what that offense looks like. So how many of those chances will he get anyway? But, he can certainly be a better than gadget player. And that's not a knock on him by any stretch, but, not a guy that's going to get 15 plus touches on a weekly basis, but in that 10 to 15 range, what he should be able to do, especially if the freaky, fluky Jerick McKinnon touchdowns sort of come, where he's scoring just in the passing game consistently, he's going to be fun. So non-PPR, half PPR, for those people more so half PPR, I don't know how great he'll be, but full PPR, where he can maybe get north of 35 catches, especially you look at this receiving core, once you get past the top 2 guys, I mean, this, Alfredo, Chosen Anderson, Robbie Chosen, whenever he's going by, Braxton Berrios, there's not a lot of standouts there. And Achane could be that third guy, especially. I love the fact that they didn't have a lot of draft capital. They didn't really need to go get a running back in the third round, but they did. And that speaks to, I think, getting a fast guy on the field, a 4.3, 240 at the NFL Combine. So there's a lot to love about what he can potentially become. And that's why you're gravitating toward him. Again, for me, it would be the first Dolphins running back to take. But I don't shy away from the other two guys, but I don't mind pairing two Dolphins running backs, give it a few weeks, and then see what happens.
I'm completely with Jamey. I like all of these Miami running backs at their current cost right now. And I think it's the fear looming of Dalvin Cook potentially signing. But if you look, Dalvin Cook is asking for a lot more money than teams are comfortable giving him right now. And then on top of what he is asking, they would likely have to cut either Raheem Mostert or Jeff Wilson Jr. They're eating over $2 million in dead cap if they cut either of those guys. So in addition to the $8 million plus that Dalvin Cook is asking for, then they've got to eat a bunch of dead cap. So I think that they're going to go into week one with the current backfield as is. And I like Achane. I think that he has the highest ceiling of the bunch, but I am fine drafting all three of these guys at cost.
Well, we've talked about 6 different players that are rising up our ranks right now. We're going to talk about 3 more. However, that's going to be over on the audio version of this episode. And listen, I've already seen who Dave's talking about, and it's a guy that he's been destroying over the last few weeks. And now all of a sudden, Mr. Flip Flopper, snip, snap, snip, snap, he's going the other way. So let's see if he can actually make a good case for this player. So you can go ahead and check that out. It's going to be in the link in the description. Click on that, and you'll be able to check out all the bonus content. We do this for every episode where we will be able to give you some more audio content on the podcast side. That has been our 6 players rising up the rankings with our special guest, Jamey Eisenberg. Thanks for watching.